Welcome to the Podcast Academy's True Crime Podcast webinar with Tenderfoot TV. I am here today with Christina Dana, who is a producer at Tenderfoot, and Meredith Stedman, who's a creative producer at Tenderfoot TV. For those not familiar with Tenderfoot, it is a content creation company that's based out of Atlanta. They've created numerous successful true crime podcasts, including some you might know, Up and Vanished, the Monster franchise, which includes Atlanta Monster, Monster the Zodiac Killer. They've done To Live and Die in LA, and they've also done Sworn. With these podcasts and many others, Tenderfoot has garnered over 500 million downloads to date. I'm Adriana Paitis with Beck Media. I'll be moderating today as we work through this workshop. Christina and Meredith will be covering the most important aspects of a true crime podcast. Three big ones: the prep, the interviewing process, and the editing process. Please feel free to ask questions. We will get to them at the end, but you can drop them in the Q&A box and we will do our best to get to them. A reminder that this workshop is put on by the Podcast Academy. You can check out a replay of it and become a member at thepodcastacademy.com. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Christina and Meredith to talk a bit about themselves and what they do.
Hi, I'm Christina Dana. As Adriana mentioned, I'm an audio producer with Tenderfoot TV. I've been on the team for a little over 2 years now. I came on originally to work on the second season of Up and Vanished, and then I transitioned to work on some other Up and Vanished projects. I helped out with some of the Monster franchise, and my sort of baby, the big project that I focus on now is Sworn, which is our criminal justice podcast. We like to say we sort of take listeners behind the bench and hear about the high stakes and sort of difficult to reach world of the American criminal justice system. And just a quick plug, season 2 of Sworn is dropping tomorrow everywhere. So if that sounds interesting to you, you can find it wherever you find your podcasts. But I'm really excited to be here today and sort of talk about our process and how we get shows together.
Hi, everyone. I'm Meredith. I'm also a producer at Tenderfoot TV. I've been at Tenderfoot, I think, just basically like 3 years right now. I started as a listener of Up and Vanished season 1 when it first started, kind of before the Breaking the Case and before the boom with the podcast. And I wrote, I came on to help write. And then I joined the team full time and worked on Sworn season 1 and then Atlanta Monster. And then from there, Up and Vanished season 2, radio rental, and I've had like other smaller editing and writing roles on some other of the podcasts that Tenderfoot does. But yeah, as you can see here, these are kind of the ones that Christina and I both have covered or touched in some way. Cool. So today we want to talk about, we thought about this, we talked on the phone, okay, how would we describe what we do? And we broke it into 3 parts that we feel really encompass being an audio producer for true crime. And that's prep, the interview, and the editing room. And we kind of hope to answer 3 questions for those of you that are into podcasting or getting into podcasting or have been in podcasting for a long time, but just don't do true crime. So those questions are: how do you find interview subjects? What do you ask and how do you ask it? And what actually goes into the podcast at the end? Yeah.
So why don't we start out with the first component, the prep. Why don't you guys walk us through the most important aspects of prepping?
So obviously there's starting with research and planning period. So for me, that usually starts with all right, what source material can I read on this? Christina, I know you start there too. So I've read anything that I can find online article-wise about a case or whatever we're looking into. I've read books on cases or whatever we're looking into. And then kind of creating some sort of Google Doc or spreadsheet or whatever to organize those thoughts. And then it really goes into the reaching out period, which I think is the bulk of that work. Christina, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that takes up a lot of the sort of beginning time, and something that I sort of tell people as advice or sort of validate to people, is that I spend a lot of time sort of sitting and thinking about how it needs to be done. And that's like a very valid use of time, is sort of envisioning a plan of how we get to what we want to talk about to a final product. And because my life is sort of situated in the way that it is, I spend a lot of that time thinking about how I can access people who can tell these stories in their own voices and with their own experiences. So just as an example with Sworn, I am not very connected to the legal system personally. And so when I was sort of thinking about how we tell these stories, I really needed to find these things that I like to call access points. And so our biggest access point is our host, Phil. He is a defense attorney. He was a judge. He was a prosecutor. He was a law enforcement officer. And so a lot of my time working with Phil is sort of brainstorming the people he knows who can illuminate problems and tell stories for us. And then the other sort of branch that I've been able to take is finding organizations who are doing any sort of work, whether it be in criminal justice reform or sort of individual victims and defense work, who are focusing on this work full time, who I can tap into their resources and their knowledge and their networks, that we can find people who can really tell these stories about the justice system. And that's not something that we do just for Sworn. That's sort of a whole process that we do for a lot of our shows. So really determining who you can contact to tell these stories and who has the voice and who has the experience to tell these stories, I think is a really important part of our job because of the nature of the way that we do true crime. We have sort of thought a lot about doing shows that are more sort of storytelling based, where we just bring to light stories that are out in the world already. And I think that that's a wonderful way of uplifting voices, but we also like to find the people who are involved firsthand in those stories. And in order to do that, you have to spend quite a bit of time figuring out the best ways to reach those people.
Yeah, I think that access points is a great way to describe that. And it can seem really daunting at first. We've all been there, where it's like, great, we need someone to talk about XYZ and we know absolutely nobody. But I always say, like, don't underestimate the power of Google. Sometimes I've cold called people or cold emailed people and been like, this is the situation, this is who I am. And those can reap great results. A lot of people do love to talk about what they do in criminal justice, or, you know, whatever you need this interview for. It could be something more scientific based, more expert based. It's sometimes a little harder to get those personal interviews with a cold email, but still, that's, I think, where 7 degrees of separation kind of comes in and really helps. We've definitely seen a lot of people on the team, like, if you're like, hey, I need someone to talk about this, or does anybody know about this? It's so weird how it ends up, you know, like somebody knows somebody who knows that story, and you end up getting this in, like you're saying with Phil. Obviously, he's such a plug for that kind of thing. But, you know, we've gotten incredible interviews from friends of friends and things like that, when you just don't even expect that it'll be in your network. But sometimes if you dig deeply enough, you'll find out, oh, I really do kind of tangentially know someone who can talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we really focus on, and Meredith and I were sort of talking about this, that it spans quite a few of our shows, is that we really like to have a balance of expert interviews and personal storytelling. I think that being able to weave both of those two kind of categories of interviewee and categories of story together has been something that's been really helpful for us to sort of think about formatting our episodes and formatting our shows. And so I think also oftentimes those two things can sort of lead to the other. So when you're looking for an expert about missing person scent dogs, they might be able to connect you with someone who has an experience, a sort of personal narrative about that, or vice versa. If you find someone who has a personal narrative, they can sort of say, and these are the people who helped me in a sort of expert field. And so your access points can also turn into access points for more people, and that sort of network begins to open up.
Yeah. And like kind of going off of that, I think that one of the things I do a lot is family and friends interviews, kind of a little bit more background on sometimes like the victim or whoever's story we're covering. And a lot of times, you know, those people can be very hesitant, rightfully so, to talk about these kinds of things, or it's very hard for them. And I find that once you've talked to one person, it like opens the doors for a lot more people to say, okay, well, I really do want to share my story or my experience with this person. And a lot of times I think the hardest part is just starting. And once you start, and once you get, you know, that first expert interview or that first family and friend interview, the doors open, and it can be hard to get to toe in, but once you do, the rest starts coming pretty quickly after that.
Totally. And I think that actually leads pretty well into our first point about the interview. If Meredith, you're sort of ready to start talking about that.
Yeah. This is, I think, where we have the bulk of the bulk of our content.
I think one of the sort of interesting things about the way that we are able to approach our projects, because of the nature of them being true crime, is that when we sit down for an interview with people, the majority of what I'm looking for is new information to me. So I like to approach, we sort of called it with a curiosity approach of, sometimes I know that I really want someone to say a certain soundbite or talk about a certain topic, but most of what I want them to do is teach me more information about whatever it is, the thing that I'm looking for, be that a specific case or sort of what happened one evening, or if it's problems in the criminal justice system that I didn't go to law school and so I don't know about. And I think that what's interesting about the way that we have sort of worked together to cover a variety of things on our shows is that most of those times, if not all of them, we're approaching with a sort of investigative curiosity mindset rather than looking for people to fill in information that we already have.
Yeah, I love that. I love the curiosity mindset. I think that your interviews turn out so much better when you're not searching for an exact answer, and when you're just really having a conversation and you're genuinely curious. Luckily, I think we're both pretty curious people knowing us, so that helps. But yeah, it really does matter, like going in with that mindset, because sometimes if you're going for a certain specific thing, you'll miss out on some other totally different topic that might even be better or might be more interesting. You didn't even know about it, but because you were just trying to get cut to the chase, you just didn't even allow that avenue to open. And I've definitely been in a couple interviews where I was like, well, I'm not even using what I thought I was going to use. Like that's not even what the best part of this interview is. And I had no idea going in. So yeah, I think that's really helpful. The mindset is important going in. Yeah. And that kind of brings me to, all right, so when you're in the interview, the important do's and don'ts that we've learned over the years. And I think this can be a bit different when you're in the interview and when you're not in the interview. So what I mean by like when you're in the interview is, you know, a traditional long form interview style podcast where the interviewee and the interviewer are talking back and forth a lot. That is a different experience than mostly the interviews that the Tenderfoot TV podcasts use. And those are when we're not in them, except for maybe tiny sound bites here and there when we feel it adds something. So for our style of interviews, we oftentimes have to hold back talking the whole time, which is very hard. And, you know, I've ruined a couple sound bites myself by saying, oh my gosh, you know, or like, interesting. And then I think, gosh, why did I say that? So I've definitely perfected like the enthusiastic nod and mouthing certain words like, wow, or like, you know, a lot of like body language in order to help make the, you know, the interviewee feel comfortable and know that I'm engaged, but I'm not, you know, talking over the audio or something like that. Now, obviously there's workarounds for taking that stuff out, but it really does help to keep clean audio. And I know, Christina, you have some ways you like to preface that and stuff. So go for it.
Yeah. The mindset, I think, and this sort of go together in that I want to go into an interview because the end goal is to get tape that's fully in the other person's voice. I want to go in with the expectation that I kind of know nothing. I want whoever is explaining it to me from the beginning. And that can be a little bit tough because you also want to be a person who has like authority that is worthwhile to speak to. And so with both that and the sort of changed active listening skills of being quiet, on occasion, if I feel like the interview sort of asks for it, I will preface by saying, this is going to be a long interview. I just want you to know that I'm going to be letting you tell the story from the beginning, letting you use your voice. And so I won't be interjecting, but just know that I am engaged and I'm listening. And if you ever have any questions or want to pause, that we can sort of talk about that. But it can feel a little bit unnatural, especially for people who aren't in the media often, to just be given space and time and silence to fill without those sort of reassuring cues back. And so when it's an interview where I know that it will go on for a long time, or it's a particularly long personal narrative, or it's someone who hasn't done an interview before, I do like to give a little preface of like, it might feel a little bit awkward, but you're doing a great job.
Yeah, I actually think bringing up silence is an important part. I think one of the most important things I've learned while working here is the power of allowing a little bit more silence than feels comfortable, especially when working in true crime interviews. For a lot of different reasons, I've seen it work out where someone says something where you're like, oh my goodness, that is a huge lead, and they didn't feel like they're going to say it, but because, the interviewer just stood there stoically, they filled the silence naturally. I've seen people add more anecdotes, give more emotion because they simply had the room to do so. And most conversations in the normal world, you want to fill that silence instantly with, oh yeah, of course, and then your own anecdote or something. So leaving that silence really helps, especially in true crime. I think it's something that's touchy. It's something that, the subject is something very delicate. And so I think a lot of people are really restrained in how they talk about it, but when given the space, they'll oftentimes give more than you even, were expecting in the first place. And that can make for a really, really good interview.
Absolutely. And I think, especially when interviews get kind of emotional, it's important to give that space, not only to let that emotion sort of play out in however feels comfortable for them, but to also sort of not push in a way where it feels like your end goal is to get something out of them that they wouldn't be comfortable with. A lot of the situations that we work with can be really vulnerable or emotional for people. And so I think we spend a lot of time talking about how we can foster an environment that feels safe and that feels friendly and that feels like somewhere where people can be open and tell their story in the way that they want to be doing it. And I think not having that sort of driving, pushing their question style really helps with that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Fostering a comfortable interview room is definitely huge. I think that we've talked about this a lot. I like to say that in all my interviews, I'm not really asking anybody to do anything that I wouldn't be doing. So I am upfront with, here's my name, here's my full name, here's my story. I'll talk with them as long as they'd like before we start. If that is what they want. And I think it's important to come in with that perspective for a lot of these interviews where you're saying, I'm being upfront and I'll tell you as much about me as you'd like. Obviously, once we're already in this position, they've probably already decided they want to do the interview. So it's more like, warming someone up and letting them know that we can stop if you want to, having a rapport, finding something to connect on beforehand. So they're not coming in the room and you just start and they are very cold and tense and they don't really know who they're talking to. And those silences can be a lot, they don't want to fill them as much if they're not really sure who you are.
Exactly. And to sort of piggyback off of that, we also want people to speak naturally and to not sound like they've written something out or that they've memorized anything. And so if you have already established that you're going to be talking to someone and having them tell their story, starting with something totally unrelated, that's some sort of connective tissue between the two of you, or, what they did this morning, or anything to sort of like start that small talk and help you feel more like a friend, also kind of jogs them out of that memorized, rote, sort of practiced thing that they might have gone into the interview with. And then you get better sound that makes for a better episode later on.
Yeah, I actually I love the point of not wanting things to sound rehearsed. I think some people do come into interviews like, I know what I'm going to say, but the more it ends up being conversational, the better it is. And sometimes that's when it's a little tough when you're trying not to talk too much, but occasionally it happens. And I think that one of the examples that I have about this is when we did the Up and Vanish TV show with Oxygen that came out this winter. And that was a different experience for me, coming from doing exclusively podcast interviews to then being filmed doing an interview. Because my, normal expressions, I had to give a little bit more to that because I was also expected to be part of that interview. And those interviews actually ended up feeling different. And it was an interesting thing that I learned, like, oh, the power of the podcast interview, not really being part of it. I think that people give a lot more to that. I actually think that one of the great things about doing a podcast is that I think that people are more comfortable when cameras are off, they're just talking to a recorder and they're just talking to you, and you are being authentic in your expressions. You're not, also being filmed, talk show style. The questions are a lot more authentic in that way. And I just realized that, wow, this is really why I like doing podcast interviews. I think that there's something really powerful about having that person only be talking to you and only be talking to a recorder in ideally a soundproof room. So that kind of leads me to equipment. I think we should talk about sort of our setup a little bit if you want to start there.
Yeah, so I talk all the time about how I feel really lucky to work in audio because it's much simpler than working in video. I think the biggest example of that is everything I've ever done fits on about half of an external hard drive, where if you were to have done the same amount in video, it would be a closet full of external hard drives. But for recording equipment, for the most part, when we're doing a sort of sit-down interview, we record using H5 or H6 recorders and RE20 or RE320 microphones. So just sort of as a personal preference, I like to use an RE320 when we're recording with women because I think it picks up midtones a little bit better, and RE20s when we're interviewing men. So the device that I have in my house right now is a RE320.
I think some other kind of setup things that I like to talk about is I personally, when doing a podcast interview, I like to have a notepad and a pen with me, and I'll tell them up front, I'm probably going to be jotting down some notes, but I'm still listening. It's just, for me. And a lot of times I'm writing back points to circle back on because sometimes when you're in a very content heavy interview and they're just going and going and going, that's great. And you don't want to break the flow. So I'm writing these circle back points. And I found that the few times that I haven't brought that, I'm like, oh, I can't remember what I wanted to circle back on. It was so many things. So I think that that's really helpful to have in the room with you. As far as soundproofing goes, we like to record in whisper room that we have in facility. But now with, COVID and having to work in different conditions, I think it's important to bring up kind of our alternative setups. I have been recording in a closet, and that works very well on the fly because, the soundproofing from the clothes around you and the carpeted floor oftentimes, that really helps. And a lot of our interviews are over the phone right now, which Christine, I know you can talk to. So how do you approach that? What softwares we use when we do that?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting having this whole sort of no traveling, stay in place situation. And it's been kind of fun because we've gotten to get a little bit creative with how we do things. I've been conducting a lot of interviews over Zoom. One of the nice things about Zoom is that it lets you record separate tracks, which makes it a lot easier to edit later on. In the past, we've used things like Zencaster. On occasion, we've had to just sort of record a traditional phone call. That's not our favorite. It's particularly not our sort of sound guy's favorite, just because the audio quality isn't as good. But it's one of those things where you sort of make it work if that's what you have going on. But when we're recording remotely, I always recommend that people use some sort of external mic, whether it's the ones that come with an Apple iPhone or if they have sort of a Bluetooth situation. But I really want to make I want to make the interview easy as possible to say yes to. So I don't want to make them have to jump through a bunch of hoops or set up a bunch of stuff. And so usually we just ask, if you have an external mic, we would love for you to use it. If not, your phone or your computer works fine. Sort of on one of the projects we're working on now, there's this really fun thing happening where there's an interview that's happening near my parents. And so we're mailing my parents a recording kit, and we're going to sort of set up there and have them mail it back. And they're very trustworthy. So that's been one of the sort of fun, creative ways that we've tried to figure out how to get the best remote audio possible.
Yeah, it's definitely been interesting in this time period. And I think it almost kind of goes back to our first bullet point, but reaching out to people right now, a lot of people I think have more free time for one reason or another, or they're home. And so I've actually gotten a lot of positive, like, yeah, I'd be down to talk over the phone. When usually I think in true crime podcasting interviews, I'm expecting a much higher percentage of no's. I've noticed that people seem a little bit more willing, and maybe it's just that their lives have slowed down in some way and they have more time to give. I also think another thing is that people are generally kind of like, oh, I'll do a phone call. Like, you know, I can hang up at any time. I can suss it out that way. Though we do prefer to do in-person interviews, we have to say. It's not the preferred way to do a phone interview, but we are just working around and doing what we can, trying to be safe. But yeah, in-person is definitely the way to go. And we try to do that 10 out of 10 times, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that the last thing I want to say in interviewing is one thing that I've learned with like, how do you ask questions that I think is important is that I've learned to not say, you know, did it hurt? And they say yes or no. I say, how did it feel? And then a lot of times I end up getting a lot, you know, better audio for us to cut, which I think will lead us to our next bullet.
Yeah, so we've talked about the prep, we've talked about the interviews and the interviewing. So now we're going to put together the narrative. So take us inside the editing room as you're really starting to build, you know, to build your show now.
Yeah, so I guess I can start with sort of just the logistics before we get into any of the like philosophy of it. We upload all of our footage, all of our raw footage to Dropbox. To varying degrees of organization, depending on the show. We've gotten better at it as time goes by, but it's sort of a wily animal organizing those. And the first thing that we do is we tag or mark up all of our interviews on the footage itself. So we, for the most part, are an audition household. We like to use Adobe with a few exceptions. And in Adobe, you can mark on the actual session whatever you want, really. But we like to mark pretty extensively exactly what has been said and the sort of themes that come up, or if you have a one-liner that you heard, making sure you really mark that so that you can go back and find exactly what you're looking for later. We found that to be a really helpful and important part of the process because it makes assembling the actual episodes later a lot easier. And that was sort of the first thing that I was brought on to do, was go through these interviews and mark. And so it's also sort of not a rite of passage, but it's an important step to see how interviews are conducted and how then you'll edit them later.
Yeah, we used to do like paper, I guess, outlines of each interview, but it's really helpful to do it in audio. And that's for tons of different reasons, as you were saying, Christina. Like, it makes it easier to, you know, go back later and cut another segment from that same interview. But also, I think in a true crime perspective, a lot of times you'll be in another interview and you'll be like, wait, what did the other guy say? And then you want to go right back to that, that audio and find that point, and having it marked right there, you know, with your own shorthand, what that person said. It's a lot easier to just cut the other one, put them together. It just ends up being like a lot smoother process. And once we integrated that, we really haven't gone back. Yeah. And like labeling, Dropbox, all that stuff is definitely important. You don't ever want to lose your interview. Sometimes these people will not do it again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about segment-based work?
Sure. So when I first came in, I had never worked on podcasts before. And I thought it was a very sort of intimidating thing to just sit down with all of this raw stuff and put together 45 minutes of things that made sense. And I was like, oh, wow, that's like a lot of things to sort of hold in your brain, which is true. But the way that I was taught by Meredith and by Payne is to really break things down into segments. And so one of the first things that I do now once I get an interview is I think about the topics that interview covered and how we want to address those, and really chunk those out into chunk edits. So if we had a defense lawyer who talked about mandatory minimum sentencing and the hidden costs of going to trial and a specific case, the first thing I'll do is break those down into segments and know that I can then sort of puzzle piece those segments in to episodes as they come up. And I think that has been really helpful for me to just sort of visualize. And even with a narrative that I know is going in one episode only, I'll chunk that into segments also. So for some of the exonerees that we talk to, I'll make a segment that says, just the arrest process, and then just the trial, and then life in jail, and then exoneration. And I have then these pieces that are a lot more manageable to work with than if it were just one long sort of 30-minute story that's all in one piece.
Yeah, and to like further break that down, like the chunk edit is just, it's not the fine-tuned final thing, but it's, okay, everything that's in this category, here it is in some sort of chronological order I'm thinking I might want. But yeah, the segment-based work is, I think, a much easier and not daunting way to approach this kind of work, where you've got, okay, let's say for this episode, I'm thinking we'll need, a segment on that furthers the plot, but then we need a segment from, family and friends. And maybe we need a segment from a forensic expert to address something from, earlier episode or earlier in the episode. And those kinds of things, rather than thinking of it just this huge timeline and having to plug it in, it's nice to think of it in segments. And also because we talk about this a lot, but people's attention spans, let's be honest, all of our attention spans are getting shorter. So it's nice to think about the interviews and like, okay, how can I boil this down into a 5-minute segment? And then even if you have to hark back to it later in the same episode, you can put it in 2 5-minute segments. This one, as a preface, and this one to kind of wrap it up. And it's just made the work a lot easier to focus on the segments. And I think it also makes it a lot easier to listen to, rather than when you have an episode that's one interview, which, there's been some of those.
Absolutely. And I'm super guilty of making long segments because I get very attached and I'm like, everything this person said is important. Everything they said is genius. And so sending my things around for notes, it's been really helpful for me to sort of come to the understanding that, yes, everything this person said was important, but if a very important thing comes 12 minutes later, people aren't going to listen to that and pay attention to that the same way they would as if you broke it up with some things in between. And so I think that's been a really fun sort of lesson for me to figure out, and kind of to like take into my personal life of thinking about how to engage people in what you're talking about in the most effective ways.
Yeah, I actually think that really goes well with our topic of one-liners.
Mm-hmm.
One-liners are so important in podcasting. That's what we call anything, like in team, that's what we call anything that is, a hook, or you want to put it in the top of the episode, the top of the segment, or the end of the segment, and the top of the episode and the end of the episode. So just these really strong one-liners, and sometimes a one-liner can be a couple of sentences, to be honest, but it's the kind of thing that when I'm in the interview, I will, underline, or I'll write, shorthand and underline that a bunch of times, thinking that's going to open their segment. And sometimes that one-liner doesn't happen at the beginning of the interview. So looking out for those, and when you're tagging and you go, ooh, he just said it so well, that's such a hook, and putting that in the front and then, going to lead up to there can be like a really helpful tactic to grab someone's perspective, rather than just having to start at the beginning of the interview, which I found, that's our, the best way to find a cliffhanger and an opener is really to like dig through that interview and find the best one-liners.
Absolutely. And I think some of the most important advice I got while I was in college, and I was studying creative writing, and so it applies here also, but one of my professors told me that an important skill to sort of work actively on is editorial ear, and sort of paying attention and being tuned into the world so that you can pick up these sentences that carry extra weight or beauty or interest or something like that. And so I think that has really helped me in almost every job I've had, of practicing that skill by reading or watching movies or listening to other podcasts, and starting to sort of develop that skill of being able to hone in on the really killer lines or the really killer one-liners.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, actually. That's really nice. I like that.
Dr. Amber Germont, she is amazing. You should all read her books.
Here we go. So I think maybe another thing to discuss then would be what happens after you've boiled it down to the best, segment possible. And that's kind of where sound design and music comes in. And that is a huge part of Tenderfoot podcasts. And honestly, I think that one of the things that draws us all together as a team is everyone here is pretty committed to making the podcast as cinematic as possible. And we throw that around a lot, but I think really what that means is we use pauses and music in such a way that we're really envisioning, okay, what if this, how could this be more like a scene, even if we're not sound designing it? Like, how can we pace this interview and use music to build suspense? How can this, really feel like a cinematic experience if you're driving in your car and listening to this interview? So it's something we kind of try to think about when we're adding those elements in. And luckily, we work with some really incredible people. We work with Makeup and Vanity Set, who is the composer for Tenderfoot TV, and he is just incredible with music. Incredible. You send him a clip and you're like, well, that was exactly what I wanted, and I didn't even know it.
10 minutes later, he's so fast.
Yeah. So he's really incredible. And then we work with Cooper Skinner, who is our sound design guy, and he especially his work has been showcased in Radio Rental, where he really takes these stories and he makes them very creepy and suspenseful. He is a sound artist. So those are the kinds of things that we are continuously trying to integrate more and more and more into our podcast. And that even starts with, Christina and my job, where a lot of times as we're doing these interviews and as we're editing them, I'll be writing down like notes or something. Okay, like this would be a good sound design moment. Like, I'm going to create a pause here for that. Or, this is kind of where I want music to start coming in because, the interview gets more emotional from here. Or this is where I want the music to stop because it gets a little bit, emotional. And I think that it actually would be better without music. Those kinds of notes are really important going in, and then like giving that feedback to, the team. And then they always, kill it with whatever they come back with.
Absolutely. One of the things we talk about a lot is that one of the backbones of Tenderfoot's mission is stories, and sharing stories and being really narrative and sort of personal about things. I think the secret sauce of Tenderfoot are all of the things Meredith mentioned, the cinematic aspects, the music, the awesome editors and sound designers that we work with. That's what really takes things sort of over the top, I think.
I agree. It really makes it brings it together. When you hear the final product, it's just so satisfying.
Yeah. It's funny hearing something that you've been in for a long time that sounds maybe repetitive or not super interesting. And then a week later, after all of this magical tinkering has been done, it's an entirely different experience.
Well, shall we hop into some examples? I know you ladies have prepared a few examples to sort of sum up everything that we've talked about today. So if you're cool with that, I'll go ahead and play these bad boys.
Yeah, I guess I'll preface one, which is from Atlanta Monster, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So clip one is from Atlanta Monster. And I think that it's a good example of sort of what we're talking about with one-liners. And we'll sum it up after.
It was always be careful. Everywhere y'all go in groups. You know what I'm saying? It was everybody was scared. And definitely the people from where we grew up. Around from where we from, everybody over there was scared because that's where they was getting the kids from. It was crazy, man. That time was like the boogeyman. It was just something we had to deal with. for the boogeyman.
Yeah, so I pulled that clip because that was the opening to, I believe, episode 1 of Atlanta Monster. And that line, you know, boogeyman, watch for the boogeyman, that didn't come first in the interview. That was, you know, middle of the interview, after they'd already introduced themselves and talked about living in Atlanta. And that actually comes next in the episode. But that one-liner stuck out so much in the team's mind that went first in the episode, and it even titled the episode Boogeyman. And it's just, I think, a really good example of something that we didn't go in asking, you know, was it like the boogeyman? It was just something authentically that came out of his mouth during the interview. And I think everyone was like, ugh, underline it. That's the title of the episode that opens it. And it was just such a great, you know, chilling way of describing the situation. And then, you know, those guys go into their background, go on to tell a great story. But that was just, you know, a great one-liner moment, and it ended up being the opener.
Great. All right, I'll go ahead and play clip 2.
She used to be in here. She had this whole downstairs to herself for a couple of years. The bed was right here. There was a nightstand over here. And mascara all over the floor. It really hurts. I can't explain it any better than that. And I just.
So I pulled that clip from Up and Vanished season 2, and that is Rodney, Crystal's de facto father. And that moment I pulled because I thought it was a great example of emotion in an interview. He was, you know, tearing up at the time, and it was super raw, and he was, you know, happy to be recorded, but it was almost like he even forgot in that moment that he was being recorded. It was one of those moments. And I also think it's a great example of when an interview evolves into something else while you're there. And in this example, we had a sit down across the table interview, and then he wanted to show us Crystal's bedroom. And he just took us up there, and he was pointing out, like, this is where her night table was, and this is this. And it was one of those moments where sometimes you forget, like, that even though it's not a documentary, you can get that cinematic feeling. You can get that, like, real personal touch and feel like you're in the room with Rodney if you follow him somewhere. And he was describing the space, and it was making him emotional. It was making us emotional. And it was just like a really, really beautiful moment. And that's one of my favorite moments from Up and Vanished season 2.
Great. Should we jump into some sworn clips, Christina?
Yeah, so I picked 2 clips that sort of go together a little bit. They're both from Sworn because Sworn is my child. And I wanted to sort of highlight 2 different motivations that people have for speaking with us and for sharing their story with us. And so the first one is from the first episode. It's the introduction of the first personal narrative that we are sharing.
When it comes to shedding some light on this nightmare that so many of us unfortunately share, I'm a walking book. The 2 most common contributing factors of wrongful convictions are witness misidentification and misapplication of forensic science. And I was a victim of both of them.
So that's Joe Diaz. He was wrongfully imprisoned for 8 years. And he is so enthusiastic about telling his story and sharing his experience as an effort both for sort of criminal justice reform, and he's very interested in restorative justice and personal growth and all of these things. And so it was such a joy working with him because he has this total open book policy, as he mentioned, this total transparency. And it really was sort of the highlight of one of the things I like to say, which is that I like talking to people who like talking to me, because I think that that makes for a really positive environment for everyone right off of the bat. And the second clip is a bit of a different situation. This is from some episodes that are coming later in the season, and she is a former client of Phil, the hosts, and she was hesitant to talk with us, but it was actually conversations with her children that motivated her to share her story anonymously. So as you'll hear in the clip, we don't use her name and her voice has been changed. And this is also the very introduction of her story.
I don't even want to use my name. You know, I feel very guarded about the whole situation. First of all, you have to remember, for so many years, like, I couldn't even talk about it, not even with my child. You know, I had to just kind of keep everything so internalized that to some degree, it's really hard to talk about it. You know, something horrible happened, and I made a phone call for help. I didn't receive help.
And so doing that interview and sitting down with her was a very different experience than sitting down with Joe. But I think it's important to sort of keep in both of those perspectives, because it speaks to how vulnerable and sort of challenging and really difficult these experiences are. It sort of speaks to the high stakes situations that we're talking about, that they can be so painful or so transformative. The other thing that I like about these two clips is that it kind of highlights the ways that we use one-liners to build suspense in different ways. So at the end of Joe's clip, he tells you exactly what happened to him. He was exonerated for these two things. And I think that that sort of really piques the interest to find out how it happened and dig into the story and know that there's this big payoff coming later. Whereas with Phil's client, I think because she was hesitant to talk with us, in the beginning of the episode, she was very sort of vague and kept things pretty vague, which is also a good way to build suspense, because as we spoke and as we got comfortable, she did tell us what happened to her. But that's a good way to sort of, again, pique that interest of something is coming, but we don't quite know what it is yet.
Also, I think if those clips were a little rocky, don't worry, the sound quality is much better in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. So it's just, I think, being filtered through Zoom.
Thank you, Meredith.
Well, wonderful. Well, I know we've gone through a lot of information. Hopefully it helped everyone. Hopefully those examples kind of put some stuff in perspective for you guys. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I think we'll hop into some Q&A. We've got some great questions flowing in. So I'm going to go ahead and just click out of this very quickly.
When it comes to shedding some light.
Sorry about that.
I told you, Joe loves telling his story. He loves talking about it.
Okay, great. And then we can go ahead and hop in. So we'll start kind of technical. We've got a kind of a good mix here of technical and sort of wider questions. So for you both, do you transcribe all of your interviews?
So that's actually interesting. I think so. We talked about marking, and I think that's generally what we do, where we think it's more helpful up front because we're working in the audio. And though paper outlines can be helpful, I think once you're amassing a lot of interviews, they start becoming less and less helpful to have specific lines in a paper outline, and more helpful to have that information truly where you're already editing, besides, like, you know, your notes outline. And we have transcribed our interviews in the past. That's actually something I used to do when I first started, was transcribe interviews. But now we generally do it after the fact, and we post it on our website, you know, like transcribing our episodes so that people can, you know, tie back to those things later on if they're interested and they're following the investigation and they don't remember a detail. We have transcribed some interviews. I just say that we don't do all of them. Not all of them are necessary to do that way. And some of them it's more helpful to mark.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that I found, really the only instance I found it to be helpful to transcribe interviews is when we're working in collaboration with iHeartRadio, just because Dropbox and Audition are finicky. And so if you need to sort of collaborate outside of the company, it's hard to have two people jump into the same session or two people find the same session in the way that you left it. And so in that way, having transcriptions can be helpful.
Yeah, and it's a lot of people at that point.
Great. I think that kind of leads to another question here. At what point does an editor step in to listen and suggest changes? How, you know, at what point are you kind of sharing what you're working on, and at what point does it come kind of collaborative?
I think it differs for each project. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think it differs for each project. It depends who's working on that project. I think a lot of the times there is someone who is getting the interview. A lot of times I think the person who gets the interview, and if they do the initial cut, it usually turns out better because they know that subject matter so well, and they'll know, you know, they'll be able to cut it a lot more quickly because they know the good points, but that's not always the case either. But yeah, someone is getting the interview, someone is cutting it into initial chunk edit, someone is giving notes on that. A lot of times that's like a couple people, like a little bit more of a team thing. And then there's, you know, another cut of that interview, and then it's time for sound design and music. But those positions can change. Sometimes it's the same people doing the editing, getting the interview. Sometimes someone's getting the interview, someone's doing the editing. So yeah, I guess there is a notes round, and usually that comes after the first chunk edit. And that is usually like throughout all the podcasts.
Yeah, there's also this sort of interesting X factor that we haven't really touched on, which is host VO. And so in some shows, it's particularly important to get notes after host VO because hosts play a pivotal role in the content. Other times the host has a much lighter hand and is sort of directing. And in that case, you can get notes on content before. And so it really just depends, and depending on how busy your host is and how quickly they are at recording. So that can also change where the notes process comes in.
That's a good point.
Great. And just kind of speaking of notes and marking up, we have another question here. How do you use Adobe to mark up audio files? Is this within Adobe Audition?
Yes. So what we do is we make a new session totally. It's usually called like the interview tagged. We put in the files directly into the session, into each track, however many people are involved in the interview. And then there's a sort of off to the left, there's a little markers column. And at least on mine, I think sort of standard, the shortcut is M. And so as you play it, you just hit M and then you go in and type into that little column what is happening in that moment. I will say, I wish that Adobe made markers sort of stick to the files, which is not something that they do. And I have written to their message board many times. But that, I think, other than the sort of locking in situation, that's what we found to be the most effective.
Yeah, it's helpful to have it in a separate, to have the interview in a separate tagged file, tag that whole file, because then you're going in, you can just, you know, highlight an area, cut it out, copy it, whatever, put it in your session that you're actually editing, and you can pull that way. You can just go in, copy a section, like I need, you know, parts where this person is talking about a getaway car, and you type in getaway car and you see all the times it's been tagged there, and you grab all those moments and you put them in another session, and then you start editing with that. So yeah, it's really helpful to have it, you know, separately done already. And that's why we choose that over paper edits where, you know, they're great, but then you'd have to go find that moment, you know, 13 minutes in, hopefully that person wrote it exactly or whatever, or the transcribing service that we use did it exactly or whatever like that. But yeah, that does bring me to a point though. We do use Rev for transcriptions when we do use it. So it's like an automated service.
And I think maybe one sort of more interesting technical thing is, at least in my experience, it takes about 3 sessions to get to an episode. So it takes the tagged raw files, and then I make individual segment sessions that I cut from tagged. And so when I'm making a segment, I have both of those sessions up and I cut from there. And then it takes the final episode session. So of those, there are many segments, there are many interviews, but those are the sort of 3 types of sessions that it takes to make an episode.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on to sort of more interview-based questions, we have one here. Do you guys have a specific vetting process for your interview subjects?
Yeah, so I've sort of lucked out a little bit in that most of the people I interview have been heavily vetted by people whose entire job it is to vet people like that. So for example, I've worked a lot with the Georgia Innocence Project, and they have amazing teams whose sole purpose is to figure out whether this person is being truthful about their story or not. And so that's been a really huge help for the way that I fact check and sort of make sure that we're talking to people who are on the up and up. So that's sort of the best way that I found to do it.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point. Like a lot of times it comes from referral, to be honest. And in that way, it kind of builds a circle of trust. Now, I will say, I think, sometimes you're talking to someone and you might not believe what they're saying. And that's kind of been a whole thing with true crime podcasting. And it's tough to always suss that out. And so I think that's when we talk about balance. We also like to balance perspectives, where you get people that believe different things. So you can get a wide spectrum of belief over what the topic is. Especially if you yourself, don't know, and, the person is vetted by some people, but not others, which is, I think, oftentimes the case where we're dealing with polarizing issues. So I think it just takes a little bit, like, who do we hear this person? Who did we get this person from? When we're listening to the interview, does it seem like, they talked about this before, or are they just pulling it out of thin air? I don't know about like specific, there's no service where we can plug it in, but we definitely do think about these things and balancing them in the episode so that if something seems very polarizing, we have a differing perspective.
So kind of going to timeline here, we have another question here that's asked, sometimes true crime stories happen over a long period of time. And there's a lot of crucial moments throughout that period of time. So how do you tell when a crucial moment of the story has happened, and how do you communicate the timeline for that? So do you say the exact date? How do you tell how much time has passed from one segment to another, especially like, with Atlanta Monster or Up and Vanished, this happened over such a long period of time. Can you shed some light on that?
Well, with those, so Up and Vanished is very unique in the way that it is produced like in real time, which is not the easiest way to do a podcast. It's really difficult to be figuring out information and producing it that week. So in that way, a lot of stuff is, here's some information, never mind, we learned new things. And that can be frustrating for some listeners, yet some listeners love that because it's very real in the moment and feels truly like an investigation. But yeah, I think that we do timelines a lot. We try to give a timeline for cases that we're working on. A lot of times time between segments, that's a really interesting point. I think that in the podcasts like Atlanta Monster and Up and Vanished that were produced very much in a short period of time, episode to episode, meaning week to week, but maybe took place over a couple of months. It didn't seem as pertinent to say this interview was done on Wednesday last week. But I think that in those times, it kind of overall, the podcast is a little bit obvious in that it's done in over a couple of months. But when there's a crucial date in the background, like in the story, that's when we mention this happened on, July 5th. This happened, in 1970. So those are the dates I think we tend to spend more time on and tend to do a timeline for.
Yeah, and just quickly, I know for projects like Zodiac Killer, and I think for DC Sniper also, some dates got full episodes. And I think that's a really good way to highlight a date, is to say, in October of 2001, that the date that it all started, that gets a full episode where we just run through that whole day. And that's a good way to emphasize like times that things have happened.
Great. Well, thank you, ladies. I think this just about wraps up our timing for today. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, everyone, but we appreciate you guys sending them in. Thanks to Meredith and Christina for joining us today, for giving their time today. Again, this workshop was brought to you by the Podcast Academy. You can find them on Twitter at the letter T Podcast Academy. You can check out Tenderfoot on Twitter at Tenderfoot TV. You can check them out on Instagram at tenderfoot.tv. And you can follow Meredith Stedman on social media at Meredith Stedman as well. Another reminder that Sworn, Tenderfoot TV's criminal justice podcast Sworn, drops a new season tomorrow on all platforms, so please check it out. And you can also check out Sworn on social media at Sworn Podcast. So thanks. Thanks, ladies.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much.
This was fun.
So fun.
Hope this helped.
Yes.